usually a coach might be seen as like the person, like they tell players what to do, this is how you do it. Whereas like in the constraints side approach, the coach would be kind of viewed more of a kind of learning designer or kind of learning companion.
Welcome to the Cutting Edge Coaching Podcast, where we believe coaches are some of the most important teachers and leaders in the world, and they deserve to be supported. I'm your host, Luke Gromer, and every week we're bringing you conversations with coaches, experts, and leaders from across sports that will give you practical ideas and strategies that you can apply in your coaching to develop high-performing teams and high-character people. Coaches, I'm excited to welcome Phillip O'Callaghan to the podcast. Phillip is a PE teacher and tennis coach in Ireland. Phillip has a newsletter for coaches that focuses on skill acquisition and practice design, in addition to blogs and insightful Twitter threads and content that can be found on his profile at Mr_tennis_coach. I reached out to Phillip to record a podcast episode because some of the ideas and examples he shared resonated with me and stimulated my thinking around several coaching topics. In part one of this two-part conversation, we dive into 4 environment design principles and examples of what each of them look like. As always, if you enjoyed this episode and want a copy of the free podcast notes, just go to cuttingedgecoach.com/podcast or check out the links in the show details to download a free PDF of notes from this episode or any episode of the podcast. Now to part 1 of my conversation with Phillip O'Callaghan. Enjoy the show. Phillip, I would love to start off and talk about what you call EDP principles or environmental design principles. You've been sharing a ton of great stuff on Twitter and through your email newsletter lately, and you shared a thread on 4 environment design principles. Will you tell us, first of all, what are environment design principles, and then can we walk through those 4?
Yes. So I suppose just to give a bit of a introduction to them, I suppose like these are all environmental design principles, all kind of come from, they were originally kind of put in a book called the Constraint Side Approach. So that's a brilliant book to check out if you'd kind of like to learn maybe a bit more about the Constraint Side Approach, if it's something you've heard of. I suppose the first thing is, like, when we're using a constraint side approach, the role of the coach would be kind of different to the way we may kind of perceive it. So, like, usually a coach might be seen as like the person, like they tell players what to do, this is how you do it. Whereas like in the constraint side approach, the coach would be kind of viewed more of a kind of learning designer or kind of learning companion. So like they're, like, I suppose the relationship is slightly different, that you're not like this kind of all-knowing person. You're someone that's going to like design environments, observe, get their input. And then the 4 environmental design principles, like the 4 are session intention, constraint to afford, representative learning design, and repetition without repetition. We could probably record a podcast episode on every single one of those and go into them for about 15 minutes, 20 minutes each. But I can kind of give a brief overview of each, or anyone in particular, because some of them might be kind of new terms for some coaches listening.
Absolutely. Yes, let's start and let's just go
Okay.
through them each and do a little bit of a brief overview. And I think later maybe we'll get
Yeah.
into
So
some
this.
more practicality as far as what it looks like.
Yeah.
Start
So
with session intention.
the session intention is actually really, really important, and it's something that's often overlooked by coaches. So when we talk about the like intention, it's kind of very similar to like the goal of the session. And then, like, say for example, if the goal of the session was to, I don't know, work on scoring, or like say scoring more in basketball or scoring more in soccer. I'll try to kind of give broad examples that would fit most sports. But say like to kind of work on finishing. So like, I suppose if our the intention that the player has, like the session intention is something that we should share with the player. The session intention is also going to kind of have a big influence on the way we design tasks. So if our session intention was to work on finishing, or I suppose getting to the basket in basketball, like that is going to have a big effect on, like, say, the information and things that the players are looking for. So like if their intention is to look to get to the basket, they're going to look for opportunities to do that. And what we a lot of the time what we do is we kind of give bonus points for maybe them exploring, which we'll get into in the next one. But so if we have that session intention, all our kind of our practice design is going to be influenced by it, and like what the players are actually doing during practice is going to have a big intention. So it's kind of very important for coaches to be kind of clear about what the intention of the session is, or what the intention of every activity is.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I was just thinking in my mind as you were talking, we need to know
Yeah,
where we're going. We gotta have some direction, some goal, like you talked about. What's the intention or the focus in this practice overall? But then, like you mentioned at the end there, it might change from segment to segment within your practice, right? There's in my practices often there's a segment where the intention and the focus is this, and in the next segment, the intention or the focus is this. That's totally okay too. I think it's important for coaches to recognize, especially when we're talking about the constraints led approach, which I think can be easily misunderstood, is that we're not saying that we do away with session intention or focus or goal, right? There is intentionality in what we're planning for. We want to get better at something specific. We're not just playing the game at random, rolling the balls out and letting them play. We're being intentional about what the goal of the session is. We want to improve our transition defense, our transition offense. We want to improve our finishing, like you were talking about. And then it gives us clarity around, okay, so then what do I actually do in my practice? If this is the intention to improve our the individual's performance at this or the team's performance at this, well, then that should totally shape how I design everything else
yeah.
in this
So like it's
practice.
going to have, like as you said there, it's going to have a big influence on the coach, but it's also going to have a big influence on the player. So like the session intention is actually probably the most important constraint, and it's probably the most overlooked. So that's where we start. And then, like, I suppose if we're
Yeah.
moving then on to, and like as you said, the intention could be different for every activity. But I suppose we would, a lot of the time we try to link them. So like there might be a kind of team through the practice, or there might be like sometimes things might pop up, and it or like you might have to get them ready for something specific. But a lot of the time we're gonna have kind of, I suppose we have planned like what is this practice going to be, like what's the goal, what's the intention, what's the goal of this practice. And then it kind of sticks along a kind of, or like we go along the same kind of line. So because it can be, I suppose one thing that I was a small bit guilty of myself is that, like, often if you're kind of, you can kind of end up kind of firefighting, because like if you look at stuff, if you kind of like just go off the cuff, there's so many different problems that you could work on, or there's so many different kind of things that you could use. And I suppose the a session intention is a good constraint for the coaches too, to kind of stick within. There are times that you should deviate maybe from that, but I suppose that's up to the coach to kind of make their like an informed decision whether they should do that or not.
I love that phrase. Yeah, we end up firefighting. We see all the issues and we try to fix way more than we're able to in the time we have, or we get scattered as coaches and not focused on what matters most. Talk to us now about
Yeah,
constraining to afford. What does
yeah.
that
So I
mean?
suppose I'll give an example, two different examples. So the first one, like constraint to afford, it might seem like a complicated term, but I'll try kind of explain it in a kind of way that for coaches to, so they can kind of use it straight away. So there's two different ways we can kind of constrain, or there's probably more, but these are kind of the two kind of main ones. So there's constraint to constrain, which means you're kind of like forcing them to use a specific. So like if you're like, an example of a constraint to constraint could be maybe be like, you can only score with your left leg, or you can only take one touch. So like we're actually say we're using a constraint, but the constraint is forcing a specific action. And like I suppose one of the problems with there's kind of two big problems. One, it's kind of like it takes away decision making from the players, which is a kind of really important thing to develop. And two, like a lot of the time it will make like the games unrealistic. So like if a player can only shoot on their left leg, then the defender can just stand on their left leg and block them or things like that. So that's kind of why we don't really want to constrain. If we if we look at constraint to forward, so like when we're talking about constraint to forward, it's kind of like constraining to forward opportunities for action. So another way to kind of maybe look at it would be it's kind of like a kind of guided discovery. So we're kind of like encouraging them to explore. Like one of the things I said in the last one was that like you might maybe give extra points for scoring in that way. So like instead of saying you have to score with your left leg, maybe it's worth 3 if you score on your left leg, but you can still score on your right leg if that's the better option, but you're not as rewarded as much maybe. So that would be a kind of I suppose example of how we'd use constraint to afford in practice.
That's good, and a really practical example there too, right? If there's something that we want them to focus on or to use some sort of skill we want them to attempt to develop, one of the best ways to do that is to constrain the game to encourage it. It doesn't mean that they're going to do it, but it does mean if they do it, it's gonna be within the context of a
Yeah.
realistic game, which is, as I think we're about to talk about, such a huge piece of this is, it's got to be that game context that they're in, that they're trying to apply the skill in or execute that
Yeah.
action in, right? And so I think that's a really helpful distinction too, as far as constrain to constrain. Right there, we're forcing a specific action. And I think maybe there's
Yeah.
maybe times for that. But like you said, constrain to afford is really, hey, here's what I want you to attempt to do or go in this direction. Try to do like I was doing this the other day in my basketball practice. Often my guys on offense, if they don't have the ball, they just stand there and watch the ball in space. Now their spacing is good, great, but what they're missing are the opportunities to cut and put pressure on the defense and potentially catch the ball in a really dangerous place. And so we just incentivized backdoor cuts. And all of a sudden, if you had a backdoor cut and you get a bucket off that backdoor cut, it was like +2, right? So now all of a sudden, it was the most valuable shot in the game. It was even worth even more than a 3-pointer if they would backdoor cut someone and finish that. And then all of a sudden, they started to try to do it. And the first time we did it, there was less of it, but then I think this is an important thing too, when we came back to it the next day and we did it again, and the next day we did it again, and that bonus was still there, they started doing it more and more. And and when they saw it, when they got those buckets with that bonus, like, it was a big deal. We made a big deal about it. They got pumped about it. And it changed the way they played. And because it was offense versus defense, because it was a realistic game environment. It was forcing the defense to learn how to defend these backdoor cuts, which can absolutely kill you if you get
Yeah.
burned on these, right? And so by constraining the offense, giving the bonus points, it also forces the defense to defend that too, to be more aware and more conscious of it because they'll get beat if they don't. So, yeah, I think that was another example that was popping in my mind as far as, yeah, when you constrain to a forward, like, it encourages them to do it more, and I think what we sometimes miss is it's really good for, right, the defense too, right? And maybe you're just working actually your intention was defending backdoor cuts, and you wanted the defense to get better at it. Well, what you could still do is give those bonus points to the offense to encourage them to do it, right? And by nature of that, now the defense is more focused on it. It's not always that you actually constrain, like, the side of the ball that you're focused on. Maybe you constrain the opposite to encourage, um, yeah, the offense to attack the defense in a certain way or the defense to attack the offense in a
Yeah,
certain way.
yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. Like a lot of the time, you will actually, if you want to work on attack, you'll constrain the defense. If you want to work on the defense, you might constrain the attack. And like a lot of the time, when you're using, say, a constraint at first, you might even over exaggerate it. So you might even give 5 points for something like a backdoor cut, and like the target to win is 20. So like you can either score 4 backdoor cuts to win, or you have to score 20 singular baskets. And then like if they're not exploring it, it's going to take them so long to win. And then like obviously that's not as realistic as you maybe want it to be. So then once you kind of see them exploring a bit more, you kind of lower the amount it's worth. But at first, like if they actually aren't, like I suppose, taking the opportunities to explore, you can even exaggerate the problem even more.
Yeah, I think you make a great point there as well, Philip. Let's go to the third one, representative learning design. Define that in simple terms for
Yeah.
coaches and talk
Okay,
about
so
what
I
it looks
suppose
like.
the goal of representative learning design is to kind of make the practice tasks as we'd say like representative or as I suppose faithful or similar as possible to say problems that the players would face in a game. So like the I suppose the reasoning behind representative learning design is that like if players are performing or learning the skill in a context that is similar or as similar as possible to the game, then the learning is more likely to transfer. So like if we were looking at say basketball or soccer or any kind of invasion game, like there's going to be a ball, there's going to be consequences, opponents, directions, rules, like kind of things like that. You're going to have like you're going to need that information. And like I suppose one of the key things behind using representative learning design effectively is like you don't want it to be like a 10 out of 10 all the time. You actually want to like scale to the levels of representativeness to an appropriate level for the player. So like um another way that we kind of talk about that is like maybe creating slices of the game. So like so we're I suppose keeping as much of the key information as possible. So we might have defenders, we might have a ball. Like the defender, if say like we're working with less skilled athletes, the defender might be at a big disadvantage, but they're still there. So like we might start them in a position um where like it's less likely that they'll be able to stop the player, but the player still needs to kind of learn how to I suppose behave when they're there. So um like with representative learning design, like I suppose a lot like there's been a lot of research done that has shown that like players perform a lot differently in representative context and than they do in like say drills or games where there's no like representative information. So um and like the behaviors that they display in the games are like a lot more similar to the ones that they would display in a game. So that's why we would try use representative learning design. It's probably one of the kind of most important skill acquisition principles um to use for coaches. And like if a coach is looking to maybe get started with some skill acquisition, that's actually probably the first one that they should look at.
I would agree with you on there. Yeah, in so many of the conversations I've had, I've just been so challenged, or the thought that keeps coming back into my head as I plan practices and coaches. Yeah, is this going to transfer to the game? And and then like that's the driving question: is this going to transfer the game? Help them get better at performing in the game? And if it's not, well, why am I doing it? Is there any value in continuing to do it? And then the other question is, what can I do? Like you said, what slice of the game can I use here that is representative of the game that's going to transfer, right? And if it doesn't look like the game in some capacity, it's probably not going to help them get much or any better at the game, because, like you said, it's like if we someone I was talking to recently, I think it was Dr. Tom Perry, he was talking about, if we develop skill in a sterile environment, it only transfers to a sterile environment, meaning like there's no defense or there's no opponent, right? Then what happens when there is someone there? Well, then whatever we did with in that sterile environment isn't necessarily going to show up there because we're not used to applying it in that environment. I think that's, yeah, like you said, so important that if a coach is looking for somewhere to start, this is it. Representative learning design. Does your practice look anything like the game? Like you said, it's not always a 10 out of 10, but do the pieces of it, the segments of it, do they look even like a slice of the game? And I like the example you gave as well, where depending on level, maybe you're giving bigger advantages, or disadvantages, depending on the level, to allow them to try to learn and apply these skills in a representative
Yeah.
learning environment. Talk to us about the fourth one, repetition without
Yeah, so
repetition.
I suppose like repetition without repetition is like it's actually quite an interesting concept that like it originally came from a Russian scientist called Nikolai Bernstein back in the 1930s. And he studied blacksmiths. Like he was kind of his job was to kind of I suppose it was in wartime, so he needed to like increase the labor, like the amount of work that the workforce could do. So that was actually what his job was. So he was like researching that area, and he kind of set up this kind of experiment where he studied the movements of expert blacksmiths, and he kind of tracked the motion of the hammer. And what he found that was like while the blacksmiths achieved a consistent outcome of hitting the nail, there was slight variations each time they performed a skill. So there was little adjustments. So like the starting position or whatever might have been slightly different. It wasn't big adjustments, but they were still adjustments there. And like, but so what they repeated was the consistent outcome of hitting the nail, but they kind of got there in like slightly different ways every time. So that's where the kind of concept of repetition without repetition came from. Um, and then like if we apply that to sport, like I suppose like there was a long held belief that like you could kind of develop per textbook technique. You had to like I suppose build muscle memory, kind of like we wanted to develop repeatable players, repeatable shooters, repeatable brain strokes in tennis. And I suppose like while there are maybe some elements that might be similar or like within certain bandwidths, it is actually like impossible to repeat a movement exactly. So that's where the repetition without repetition comes in. And like what it means is that like we're trying to give the players opportunities to solve a problem, but we're kind of creating slightly different conditions every time for them to perform in. We're not expecting them to do it in the same way, but what we're looking for is that they can kind of get a consistent outcome. So, like, are they scoring the basket in different positions in different ways? We're not looking like they can only score in this way. So yeah, I suppose that's the kind of premise behind repetition without repetition.
I think what many coaches would say at this point, or coaches that maybe haven't adopted this philosophy or theoretical framework, would say something along the lines of, right, the questions of, well, what about fundamentals? But then also, well, so does this mean I can't teach technique? Or is there a time and a place to teach technique? Or do we just tell them to hit the ball over the net and we let them figure out their own
Yeah.
technique? What would your
Yeah,
response to that be?
I suppose like the first part there, like I suppose coaches should maybe ask themselves like what are the actual fundamentals of the game? I'd say the ability to, I suppose, make decisions, to track the ball, all of those things would be more fundamental than like say performing an action. Then if we, I suppose, like if we're looking at like from my point of view, we like there's a big difference between skill and technique. So like skill is how we apply a technique or whatever to solve a problem. Like so and like I suppose it's very context dependent. So like the context you're performing the skill in is never going to be the same. So we need to be able to adjust and like what we're actually looking to develop is skill adaptability rather than skill repeatability. And then the next part was like, is there room for technique? Um so I don't want to make it too complicated, but I suppose like if we're looking at every movement, there are things that are called attractors, and attractors would be things that are like kind of like features that would be common among a lot of like among high level performers, and then there's things called like fluctuations. A nice way I heard that kind of maybe described before is that we have like I suppose we have maybe fundamentals in the movement. I don't really like using that word, but I'll just use it here. They have every movement has some fundamentals and it has some style. So like the attractors, I think, is the better way to look at it, is like um different, like maybe elements of the movement that might be common, and then the fluctuations are like the little changes that the players have to make. So like there are attractors, but I suppose the way we work on them is a lot different. So like we're not looking for them to be able to repeat the attractor like over and over again. We're working on how can they adapt within a specific maybe bandwidth. So like I don't like, I suppose from our point of view, we wouldn't really look at like, oh, you need to get your elbow to like 90 degrees. Like there might be, you need to maybe get your arm up in a certain like position, but there's going to be variability within that. I hope like that wasn't maybe too complicated, but I suppose that's the way I'd look at technique.
I like that a lot. I think it's helpful too. And when you're talking about attractors and fluctuations, I was just thinking those attractors are the common movements when the
Yeah,
skill is performed. That these are a few of maybe kind of the principles of the skill being applied effectively, and then the fluctuations are this is how it's uniquely like there's uniqueness in it too based on our bodies and our individual constraints that we have. I think it was Dr. Tom Perry that shared with me because I think I asked him a similar question. He said the only times that he intervenes on technique is if it's not functional or if it's
yeah,
not safe. And so functional meaning it doesn't achieve the desired outcome. If there's an athlete that's trying to shoot a basketball and they can't make it in the hoop consistently, there might be a totally legitimate reason to intervene with some what is traditionally called technique, right? Or right in tennis, if this player just cannot figure out how to return the shot and their outcome is poor, well, then maybe we do need to step in and intervene there. Or like
yeah,
if it's not safe, if they're performing it in a way that's going to hurt them or someone else, and we should step in. I think that's really helpful. I love those 4 principles of environmental design. They were session intention, constrained to afford, representative learning design, and repetition without repetition. Yeah, really good stuff. Phil, this has been an awesome part 1 of the conversation. And coaches, we will be back next week with part 2 of the conversation. Coaches, thanks for listening to this episode, and a huge thanks to Phillip for joining me. We'll be back next week with part 2 of this conversation. You can find links to connect with Phillip in the show details. And don't forget to check out the show details if you'd like to get access to the free podcast notes from this episode or any other episode of the podcast, or learn more about how we serve coaches. Thanks for listening to the podcast. We'll see you next week.